Greetings and welcome for part two of our discussion. If you join us for the first part, we'll be really just jumping straight in. In fact, it's just a clip. There's not a clean way to go in. But for those of you maybe joining us for the first time, you might want to go to the first part of this video where we go in detail, really kind of almost an introduction to J.R.R. Tolkien, but we do try to hone in on the theme of Providence. Today, we will do a similar approach to C.S. Lewis, a little bit more basic approach as I introduced Aaron a few to the themes that he was not familiar with. So without further ado, here is part two of our interview and discussion on J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis, especially in the theme of Providence. God bless.
C.S. Lewis in his space trilogy. So first, a brief introduction to that. Like as we said earlier, Tolkien couldn't stand the Chronicles of Narnia, and I remember I read it for sort of academic reasons. I enjoyed them, but I also very much saw, like, I was ignorant of this spat between Lewis and Tolkien, and I kind of perceived it. Particularly when he comes out and says, there's one book where he comes out and says Aslan is Jesus, and I was mad. I was like, why would you do that? Like, you just ruined, a more contemporary way to say that would be, you broke the fourth wall. Why? And you didn't do it well. Like, give us a good reason for it, but you did not. So I found what I find the better elements of the Chronicles of Narnia are the real elements where he just commits to his ethos there. Like, I really love this scene, and I used it to teach with Lucy and Aslan, where Aslan is talking to her, and they're addressing that Aslan was calling her to separate from her brothers and sisters, and she didn't, because she put her obedience to them underneath her obedience to God, since Lewis explicitly says that I'm going to do it too. And this is problematic, and we do the same thing, and it's sort of a good motivation, but it's a wrong choice. And so Lucy asks him, well, would all these people have died if I would have done that? And Aslan says, I never tell what might have been. That's a little facile way of putting it the way that God does, but I think there's a principle there that's very true, because it would be too much for us. So, he doesn't tell us all of what might have been because it's too much of a burden for us to bear, so he bears it unto himself. But the point is that he cops out on this too often in the Chronicles of Narnia. But having now read the Space Trilogy 2 or 3 times, and I think Emily Byers told me this, so you can ask her when, next time you're with her. I'm pretty sure she's the one who told me that that Lewis and Tolkien had like a bet, because they were talking about this thing of analogy, and the bet was like, heads or tails. Heads, I write a Space Trilogy, and tails, you write a fantasy work. So you can see where this is going. This ended up being part of, I think it was, this is how The Lord of the Rings partly came about, and the Space Trilogy came about, because Lewis does mention in one of the afterwords that he makes an explicit reference, which I didn't pick up reading the books, I read it in the afterword, to the Númenóreans. Like, he's like, if you want to learn more about this, you have to read from my friend Tolkien, which frustratingly has not published it yet. Like, if he ever gets over himself to it.
So, what's hilarious? She might deny this, and I might be wrong. I think I told Emily Byers that story.
Oh, really?
It's apocryphal. I don't know that it's true. But she and I, we went to grad school at the same time.
Yeah.
And we would carpool to New Orleans together. I think I told her that.
Well,
she might say otherwise, and she might be right.
There's a good adage that goes with that, and I don't know who I got it from, that the way you answer that is about the apocryphal story. You said, it might be a lie, but it sounds good.
There it is. I like that.
So anyway, but I really think Lewis, at his best, more than any other work that I've read of him, and I haven't read some of his better works. Like I still have meaning to read. What was it, The Everlasting Man? You said
That's Chesterton.
what was the one that's like that? That's from Lewis, but you mentioned it. Well, anyway,
Mere Christianity.
No. Well, anyway, but I
Screwtape
still have.
Letters.
I still have. Screwtape Letters was the first thing I read from Lewis. It was in
You have
high
to read.
school.
So I can tell you the Lewis books you have to read. You have to read Till We Have Faces,
I
which is
have.
his.
It
So,
is like
okay.
one of my favorites.
Oh, it's amazing. You have
I
to
think
read.
I introduced Emily Byers to that book because we had to read it in seminary.
You have to read The Abolition of Man,
Okay, haven't done that one
and
yet.
you have to read A Grief Observed.
I think we had to read that in the Doctor of Ministry class that I had to take for ministry. Like we had a ministry academic class, which I thought was the most ridiculous thing. But we did have to read A Grief Observed, and we watched the movie, and I appreciated it. I think I appreciated it more for its literary value and the ministry value, but it wasn't what came out in that class. I promise you, because he actually does some great things in there. But that's for another time. But coming back, I really think that the Space Trilogy is it is the work for Lewis. I think it is the most pure. It is the best work that he produced. It's my opinion. Because he escapes this problem that he has in other works. He's sort of being an apologist overly. It would not be fair to say that of Billy Graham, but it would be kind of like some people might criticize Billy Graham for that. Like, I've gotten a new appreciation the last couple of years for Billy Graham. Like, he really was a man of God, and he really loved God, and he really wanted to bring... That was his only motivation. Like, he had no motivation, from what I can see, of being an apologist. He just wanted you to know God. And Lewis had this sort of apologist. An apologist for people, it's if you listen to Catholic radio, you hear a lot of people who are an apologist, and they're going to say, like, this is how you explain purgatory to a Protestant. And I've decided I think that's a deficient, like, I'm not going to share my faith that way. If you want to know, I will share my faith with you, and we'll talk about purgatory, but I don't need to give you a gotcha that this is why.
Any good theologian will tell you that the work of apologetics is necessary and important, and it's also the lowest possible form of theology.
It's kind of like translators or traders. It's of that ilk.
Right.
For those who've heard that. They probably haven't, but I'm going to say it anyway. So Lewis in the Space Trilogy, he escapes himself from being an apologist, and he really, and the philologist in him comes out too. Like, just like, not as much as, like, my later readings in the last couple of years with Lord of the Rings have been deeply enriched by listening to the audiobooks. Because I'm not as good at the Elvish as you are. Aaron corrects me on my Elvish, which is good. At least he did when we were on the radio show, and I appreciate it because I love the Elvish. I just don't quite get it as quickly. But listening to the audiobooks, particularly because they actually sing, Aaron. They actually sing the songs.
Oh, wow.
And I of necessity, I kind of, my first readings, I almost skipped over them. In other ones, I read them, but it was a bit tedious for that low reader score that I have that we were talking about before. But hearing them sung, like, such new meanings out of the books came. And it wasn't as that because Tolkien is definitely more of a philologist than Lewis. But that side of him comes out in the Space Trilogy. And hearing some of the things said out loud, like Fixel Triggy is a species of people in the books. And when I was just trying to guess how to say it, when I heard it, like, it brought a new level of meaning. Because it wasn't, like, new sci-fi movies, they're like the blah 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 race and the blah 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 race. Like, it has no meaning. They just throw letters together. But for Lewis, he's actually drawing from real world things. So, like, it's kind of like if someone spoke Hebrew and you don't read it, or like in psychology, the ink blot test. Well, they did another test where they put, like, ink blots that have no meaning and then, like, Hebrew characters which look like ink blots, and your brain measures them in a different way that they can actually record because it's intelligible. Even though you don't know what it means, it's intelligible.
Interesting.
That would be a podcast of philosophy and theology that would be entirely out of our scope today. But back to Lewis in this trilogy. What I wanted to bring out of them is he also, what I think he does without realizing he does it, and that's why it's so well, is he probes a lot of very human realities in Space Trilogy. I will say to you, because it was part of what you said to me in our emails together, and to my readers, if you set out to read the Space Trilogy, the first of which is Out of the Silent Planet, I believe is the first one, I will confess to you the first about third of the book is difficult to get through. And myself, I failed to read it my first time because I was totally defeated by that first third, because it's, you know who I think would get through it easier? Like someone who went to school in England. Because you have all this professorial stuff of like he's on his break from a professor and he's going through the English countryside and he has this sort of English head and this English, like it's so foreign to us that it's like you have to commit a lot to it. Whereas a British reader, I'm sure, doesn't have to pay the British tax there.
Well said.
Because right after that, then you have to pay the sci-fi tax because he's talking about like this spaceship and he's describing this sort of journey. And it is necessary for the story, but you feel very like the story's on pause because he's getting caught up on details. But then once he sort of gets his own story and he's separated from some of the other characters, it really comes into its own. And then like he really catches his go at the last third of the first book. Like that's where he really starts to, just really get some wonderful things in there. A teaser I can throw out that fits in our discussion is that he's been running away from this alien in the book because he's terrified of what he thinks he's there for and what he thinks this alien is. And it's completely other than that. And so when he finally meets him, this being is trying to understand, and he says, why were you running away? Because they couldn't understand. They actually saw them while they're traveling, and none of them, they couldn't understand the strife and the sin. They couldn't understand that he was being offered up as a sacrifice for greed of the other men. And he couldn't understand that someone would have a good purpose, which is bigger than himself, being a human creature who experiences sin. But coming face to face, he sort of repents and sees things as they really are. And it's really beautiful. And it's also comical because you sort of see modern man in the other characters. And it's insanity. I'll give you, so these creatures are a little bit sort of like angelic. I have to say that for this to make sense. And he's being kind of a translator between them because there's a linguistic thing that's going on too. And they're trying to understand. This is like, has he lost his mind? They're saying about this other creature because he can't accept higher beings, and he's like trying to like think they're tribalistic creatures. And he's being, it's so absurd when you read it because you, the reader, know what's really going on, and it's absurd. So it actually tells them in a very medieval way that you would appreciate from your study. In a very medieval way, he says, take them outside because his blood is very hot and dump water. Do you have water? Dump it over his head. So I'm sorry for all those who don't know about medieval theology in the book. You just have to laugh a little bit. But that's what's going on in one of the books. But it also begins this theme that comes out in the other books of like the providence. And the providences of what he's been running away from is not at all what it really is, which isn't that a metaphor for our lives? We run away from what we think God's plan is, and what it really is better.
Yeah.
So the example, and I'll let you cut in, before we start to conclude things, I'll jump to the third book, because the third book is what really made me change from, our initial discussions a few weeks ago and said, given the current events with, the virus and everything, I really felt this was on my mind, this last book. So the first book, Out of the Silent Planet, you meet all the characters and they're new. You can read them independently, Lewis actually says. The second book, he's on another planet, and it's kind of a very different story, but it's in the same universe, and it does have its own a beautiful reflection. I'll put it this way: the second book is a beautiful reflection on creation, like the book of Genesis, but he doesn't. It's weird because he hits you over the head with it, but he doesn't. Like, he does it in a way that I think Tolkien would even grant, if that makes any sense to you, Aaron. Because he does it in his universe, and he doesn't try to make it. The only thing that he retains is that there's the Most High God, which is our God. But the angels sort of make the translation into literature. But you get to sort of reimagine Genesis the way that God wanted it. And I think that's a worthy thing to look at through literature. It's not something we can do through theology, but it is something we can do through literature. And he does it in such a marvelous way. And he gets, actually, I will give you one quote that will whet people's appetite, and hopefully your own for that. Let me pull it up. I do have it. Let me get to the book here. Which book? Yeah, Perilandria. Oh, actually, both the quotes I have is from here, I think. Here we go. So, we have this sort of human tendency that's sinful that, I use it. My parishioners that are listening will laugh because I use it as a trope all the time. A trope that I always use for sin. Concupiscence, if you're going to hear it in my homily, is like eating too much chocolate cake. Not just one piece, eating the whole cake. That's concupiscence is a trope that I use. And this plays off of that, and he really goes into this in a helpful way in the second book. So the point in the book is he's decided, like, he has to vie with this evil creature. Like, he's been trying to get it through words, and he finally realizes, like, I have to do something, and this is I have to do it. And so he's kind of getting to his last meal, and so he's kind of thinking, like you and I were talking about, what would be an appropriate beverage for us to drink. We had a little discussion about that for our listeners. It was an enjoyment for us because it was part of, yes, there it is. It was part of the genesis of this meeting in the first place. So at first he's like, I'm going to find in paradise this fruit that'll, like, be my last meal. And the way that we would think of it is like, I'm going to order a steak and 3 bottles of wine or whatever. And this, for the same reason that, like, now prisons are discontinuing that practice, because, like, one prisoner broke the camel's back when he ordered all this food and he didn't eat any of it. He literally just had it sit there. And Tolkien has this not Tolkien, Lewis, and here he says, so here's the quote. Right after he's looking for a better thing. However, I teach the beasts that they will never be better than I, but it is a joy beyond all, not the better joy than ours. Every joy, so the present moment, every joy is beyond all others. The fruit we are eating is always the best fruit of all. And it's a truth of God. We always think, like, when you're a kid, right? Man, when I get a big kid, like, then I'll really, when I can drive a car, then I'll really, and we learn, like Chesterton says. Remember, Chesterton says, then I became an adult and I realized that they were liars. They had it wrong. We miss it. We realize, why didn't I appreciate high school when I was living through it? I didn't realize. Or when I was studying in university, and, like, man, when I finish and get my degree, then I'll really study. And we forget, we realize that, no, we missed our opportunity. Father Fry had told me when I was in school, he said, don't let your studies get in the way of your education. Same kind of theme. And my last quote to tie up a teaser for you, Aaron, and the readers, on the theme of providence in these books is from the end of this second book. The third one is the one that actually fits the most for us. So my teaser for that will be, for those of you who've been hearing me talk about Mark Mallet and the Countdown to the Kingdom website that they have. This is pure literature, but it fits into that tradition in a way that might even be prophetic. The third book, but it's sort of an apocalyptic literature, the third book. Not the coming of Christ at the end of all time, but the middle coming of Christ kind of thing. So this is, though, going back to the point of providence in the second book. It's after he's defeated, this evil thing, and they're sort of trying to comprehend the mind of God, the angels and the sort of Adam and Eve creatures. Here we go. Nope. Okay, so the angels here, the angelic sort of creatures, are discussing a problem that they perceive, like how does the will of God unfold? And this is what they say. We would not talk of it like that, said the first voice. The great dance does not wait to be perfect until the peoples of the low worlds are gathered into it, which would be kind of like us. We would be a sort of the low worlds. We speak not of it when it will begin. It has begun from before always. There was no time when we did not rejoice before his face, that would be God, as now. The dance which we dance is at the center, and for the dance all things were made. Blessed be he. So there you go, Aaron.
I like that. That's good. That's good. It's fascinating. And it's certainly, to tie this back into the beginning of our discussion, right? This, as you yourself were referencing in the Silmarillion, that Eru, right, God, as it were, produces this song that these other beings sow their own parts into, even their own discord, and they're unaware. They can only see their part of the song. They can't see the whole of it. That's something Tolkien tells us. So much so that they even struggle. You see Melkor who sings his own discord and yet goes into the world and still struggles against it. And yet Eru the whole time, smiles. This idea that for whatever reason we can't in this life know, maybe ever, that God chooses to allow our folly to sometimes not even be folly. Mm-hmm. He allows it's like, a lot of parents, though, when they're cooking and their very, very young child, says, "Oh, I want to help. Mommy, let me help. Daddy, let me help." And they'll let the child, maybe they'll be bold enough to let the child stir. But some parents will even go so far as to let their child throw in the ingredients, And if you've ever done that, maybe your child threw in too much. Maybe they damaged it somehow, and you have to try and fix what they did. But the bizarre thing about God's providence is that's not how it works. That the too much or too little ingredients was actually exactly what he intended, because he allowed it. And it becomes, through that, the greater meal. Right? This idea that it's like reading a book.
Yeah.
But God's the reader. We are the characters. And he's writing us, but if you've ever imagined a scenario, sometimes you imagine people in the scenario, and you don't really, you do in a strict sense, but you don't really plot out their movements because you know who they are. Mm-hmm. Everyone's done that. Everyone's imagined a situation in their mind where the people they imagine act the way they would. You didn't explicitly say, and then they'll do this. Just in your imagination, they do that. And now that's not real. They don't really have freedom. But that's the closest we can talk about it, that we do have that freedom. God does really give it to us.
Right. Well, that gives a good way to come to a close of our discussion, because it was part of what you say is part of the genesis in my mind of it, and how it's just fun for us to discuss it, but it also has bearing on us in the present time. Because everyone is, did God create the coronavirus? Like, how does God allow that and this and that and the other? And the reality is, like, no, God did not create the coronavirus. One way or the other, it is a result of sin. Mm-hmm. He in no way created the coronavirus. And yet, it cannot but play a part in his providence. Like, the way of discussing God's omnipotence here is that the devil cannot do so much evil that it doesn't serve God's purpose. Like his very evil serves God's purpose. There's an exorcist I heard brought this to a new level for me. And he says that God allows the devil to possess a person so that they can grow in holiness. Now, it's not quite the way that we would think about that.
Right.
But it fits this idea of providence. That even, like, when we take the grace that God gives us, it really does serve our holiness. You know, because the person who is going through an exorcism, they have no choice but to grow in holiness.
Yeah.
And so it really does serve that, to the point that even the devil's pokings, that's what's helping you, because now you have to choose against them, and you're becoming holy because you're saying, no, I love God more than that.
Right. Well, it makes me think, we talked earlier about apologetics, and the problem with apologetics is that it necessarily, to accomplish its goal, it has to simplify things. So if you were to ask an apologist, does evil come from God? The apologist and any Christian would probably say, of course, no. And they'd be right in a sense, but the true answer is yes. Evil does come from God. Not that God creates evil, but he creates us and we create evil. And so ultimately, right, God is the source of it because he's the source of us. That doesn't mean that God does evil. That doesn't mean that God wills evil, but it's exactly what you said. And it's exactly what we see Tolkien depict. That simply by creating me, Aaron Breaux, God has allowed evil to exist. He is, in some ultimate sense, responsible for it. But the difference between me and between God is that I do evil. God can take evil and turn it to good, which, of course, is the word of Scripture, I make all things new. Right. That's the power God has that we don't have, and that's what providence boils down to.
That is the miraculous thing about God's providence, just like you said, that he can take an evil thing and make good out of it, which is not something, no, it's not something we can do at all. We can participate with God's creative work in that, but we can't do it on our own. It's not a human power. For the record, C.S. Lewis, in the books we were talking about, and I say this more for your benefit, Aaron, he does, I think in a lot of ways, he tackles that idea, but in a very different way. You can kind of, I almost, having read it now 3 or 4 times, it's like a searching in Lewis. Like he's like searching, it's like your students who say, what do they call you, Mr. Breaux? Do they call you Mr. Breaux? Yeah. Like Mr. Breaux, like how does like God allow this? And so you can kind of almost see Lewis churning through it in a brilliant way, because he has thought about these things very deeply. So that's there. Maybe to come to a close, we can throw out maybe a few fun things. Like I think my listeners will hear more about what I'm doing because they kind of hear it every day. So I'll go back to what I put in our notes about a fun thing. One thing I really liked about the Prancing Pony podcast is they have these cool monikers. Like one of them calls himself the real life Lord of the Mark, because it actually goes with his name and their little philology of it. And the other one is Man of the West, and it goes with their name. So my first name,
you have to explain those.
Oh,
what is the Lord of the Mark and the Man of the West?
Well, quickly. Well, the Man of the West is the easiest, because Aragorn, the character in the Lord of the Rings, Aragorn. Thank you. See, I told you I needed.
Aragorn is a dragon in another book, I think.
See, this is why I have to have Aaron around. I told you already that I need it. So Aragorn is also called not Dunedain, but the Dunedain, right? Did I get the pronunciation right there? This is one I've worked on. Father Sam Fontana helped me with that one. Dunedain. He's the Dunedain, which means sort of in the language of the books, man. Is it the Men of the West, and then
the Dunedain are the Men of the West, and he is the
he's like the Man of the West.
The Dunedain. So the Dunedain is plural, Dunedain is singular.
Thank you. So this guy in the podcast, his name, I forgot how he rendered it from his name, but it was like Man of the West. And so he's like the real life Man of the West, and then the other one's like the real life Lord of the Mark, which is in the Lord of the Rings movies and the books. You have the Rohirrim, who are their land, they call it the Mark, right?
The Riddermark.
The Riddermark. And so the the Lord of the Mark is the king. Oh shoot, who's the king in the books? The one that dies. Oh, we
Oh my
shouldn't say that.
goodness.
We uh,
Theoden.
Theoden, yes. Theoden is the Lord of the Mark, and so is this guy. His name literally sort of almost characterizes that, so they say that. So anyway, so my name Corey is nearly as exalted as that, but my first name Corey is Gaelic. And in Gaelic, I finally met a man who really spoke Gaelic. He was from Ireland and spoke Latin. He said, like, in the streets, they used to speak Latin, but they spoke Gaelic. And he said that he's like, oh, yeah, that really does mean a couple things, because I wanted the definitive answer. But from what I could find out, Corey one meaning is raven, which I always use that because we used it in Latin class. It's an easy false cognate. Raven in Latin is Corvus, so I would use that as my name in Latin. And the better meaning, though, in Gaelic is like the hollow of a log, or the gap between two cliffs, or from the hollow. So I think from the hollow sounds very hobbitish. I think hobbits would use such a name.
Yeah, from the hell. Well, I mean, Crick Hollow is a
Mm-hmm.
place in the Shire.
Mm-hmm. Keep going with what would be your little fun things. I got to go take care of something right quick before
Oh, I'm all alone? Oh, geez. I'll do the
just
same thing.
just for a second.
I'll do the same. So my name is Aaron, of course, which, as any Christian knows, is a Hebrew name, right? Aaron, the brother of Moses. Um, and the name Aaron actually means the high, lofty mountain, the holy mountain, which, if you think about it, anything in the Old Testament that the Israelites do relating with God, it always takes place on a mountain. You know, Moses gets the Ten Commandments on a mountain. Jerusalem is built on a mountain, that sort of thing. So it's this reference to the holy place of God. So I guess if I were to come up with a name, there are Lord of the Rings holy mountains.
Yes.
But to tie it into what you were just saying about the Dunedain. So the men of the West, which are the race of humans, not elves, humans who are, for various reasons, without getting into the story, they are unique. And they lived for a time on this special island that they eventually left and came back to Middle Earth. But there was on that island holy mountain where they worshipped the gods and the God above all. So I guess maybe my name would be Man from the Mountain, or Man of the Mountain.
That sounds like Beor.
Mm.
Your beard would go with Beor. Well, they don't have red beards, but I always imagine Beor as having a beard.
A lot of them, they do talk about having beards.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
You go with that? Great.
Yeah, I'll go
All
with
right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. It's been our pleasure. I hope it's been yours as well. And until next time, God bless and keep you all.
that. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Thanks again for joining me and Aaron for this discussion we had about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I know that Aaron enjoyed it. If you really did, please like the videos, but more importantly, leave a comment. What you really enjoyed, what you'd like to hear more of, or would you like to see some more content like this? As I said, I just did it for fun, something I've long wanted to do with Aaron. And given that everyone's at home looking for something to do, I thought I might share it with you. But until next time, God bless and keep you.